All right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And I got a killer rhetorical analysis writing workshop for you with a very intriguing text. It's Pet Finder Prancer. So this woman wrote an ad to basically pawn off her demonic chihuahua by the name of Prancer, and it's rhetorically loaded. My kids had a field day with this. I used it as a test prep, a cold read piece, and my students did fairly well in ascertaining the meaning of the piece. There are some trickerations going on, especially at syntactical level, that they needed a little bit of help with, but definitely a cool piece to get our kids ready for the exam. So I'll jump right in and we'll take a look at the prompt. So here's what I cobbled up. It says, in April 2021, Tyfanee Fortuna, a New Jersey foster dog owner, posted to Facebook the following description of a dog she was fostering in the hopes that it would garner attention and get the dog adopted. The post went viral with thousands of shares, and she received hundreds of adoption applications for the dog. Read the passage carefully and write an essay in which you analyze the rhetorical choices that Fortuna makes to convey the message. So just for context, what I did was we did a timed writing on this. I gave my students 42 minutes kind of in preparation for the exam. They wrote and then they compared their writing to the examples that I wrote, which are presented in this writing workshop. So all the introductions, all the body paragraphs, the conclusion paragraph I wrote, and my students will compare it to mine. So before I jump in, please subscribe to the channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Spread the word far and wide to students, friends, and colleagues. So the first question we got to ask ourselves after we read this and ascertain some meaning and get to the construction of meaning of it is, so how do I write the intro? And for those that are familiar with my work, you know that I always use the declarative thesis heuristic. But here's the kicker to that. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. Right? In order for this to make sense, and especially if you're using whatever it is, templates, heuristics, I tell teachers in the National Writing Project when I work with them, there's a seismic difference between assigning writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. So I'm going to explicitly teach it by writing models and exemplars for my students, just like Bob Ross. And Bob Ross used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. And my students for rhetorical analysis, they know that they got to declare the thesis and then all body paragraphs will be written syllogistically. But in saying that, there's some top secret news with regards to that prompt. And here it is. Here's the truth bomb on that. Implicit in any FRQ2 prompt on the AP Lang exam, and even if you're doing rhetorical analysis at on-level courses, there's always two questions implicit in any prompt. The first one is, how does the author construct meaning? And the second is, what is the authorial intent? So when you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? I tell students to focus on the three most germane, relevant, pertinent terms, devices, techniques, and then authorial intent. Other teachers might call that universal truth, universal theme. So the entire introductory body paragraph is going to take 4 sentences, 3 construction of meaning, 1 authorial intent, and I will break that down for you. So one of the things I have my students do while they read is they go term, device, technique hunting. And some of you got to figure out where your students are at the time of offering this assignment. Some of you might need to break down the text with your student and show them kind of, the syntactical fancy work in it and the satire and the pathos and things of that nature. But I'm offering this literally 2 months before the exam. So my kids have this for the most part. I've taught them how to read and I've taught them how to write. So I gave it to them cold. Let me break down what the declarative thesis looks like graphically. So in this model, in this heuristic, students want to begin with the thesis. And I always tell them this. choose the most relevant term device technique and lead with it. That's going to be your thesis, right? So you lead with construction of meaning, and you need 3 sentences of that. So it's kind of like a tri-layered thesis statement. From there, you got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, and all that is the universal truth, the theme, the authorial intent. 1 sentence of that. The other components are, it's an academic paper, so I do want to see tier 2 level vocabulary, and all I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber word. Sentence constructs, the idea that rule number 18 in Strunk and White's Write It Right espouses that there's 12 different sentence types, but there's 20 ways to pattern those types. So my kids at sentence level are syntactical ninjas. They know how to draft different sentences to break up that monotonous flow of ... that a lot of young, emerging, struggling writers do. They overuse independent clauses. And then, as I've already alluded to, exactly 4 sentences long. So let's break down that math again. 3, construction of meaning. 1, authorial intent. So let's take a look at exemplar number 1. I'll read it all the way through and then I'll unpack it for you. Dejected and beyond fatigued, Fortuna goes the route of humor to present the unpalatable task of pawning off Prancer. Principally through anecdote, she offers a litany of this demonic dog's charm and angst-filled demise. Even at sentence level, the truncated flow belies the paradoxical mix of deep love and drudgery she feels for this confounding mutt. Never for a moment does Fortuna mix her words. This is a hard sale to transact, but the right person is out there somewhere. She so desperately hopes. So let's start with the 3+1. You can see right out of the gate that I'm getting at her ethos, right? The fact that she's been trying for 2 months to pawn off this dog. And she says right in the beginning, okay, so I'm tired. First words of the piece. So I started there. I also get at anecdote, litany, and syntax. So I think that all of those comprise and constitute the construction of meaning. That's the main thrust of the piece. Now look at my sentence constructs. One of the things I tell my students is don't parallel your sentences. So pay attention to sentence 1. And in sentence 2, don't parallel it. Do something totally different. And you can see here in my model, I do. Drop sentence 2, go to 3. 3 should not mirror 2, right? And the same for 4 and 3. So if you drop it, run away from it for a little bit and keep altering it. So you can see that in here, I'm doing some things with, some dashes, and throughout the rest of them, I'll be using colons and semicolons. And that's all stuff that I do in my Nuance Academy to make sure my students know how to wield some syntactical flair at their reader. In terms of tier 2 level vocabulary, I like, words like unpalatable, truncated, paradoxical, confounding. But one of the things I tell my students is this: the more flip the text is, the more that you can get into colloquial and vernacular usages. So in this one, I use the word mutt, right? It's very informal, kind of flip, but it works because the piece is so lighthearted. All right, that might be confounding. It might be a little nebulous for you. So let's do it again. Let's take a look at exemplar number 2. Forthright and never mincing her weary-worn words, Fortuna presents the obvious. Pawning off Prancer is going to be one tall order. Paradoxically adorable and demonically horrific, this critter has a long litany of baggage to dissuade any prospective pet parent. But her appeal to this special someone brokers a balance of positives and negatives. Written in frank and matter-of-fact sentence constructs, she spells it all out. Prancer's not just wonky, but a tad bit possessed with his maniacal disposition. Primarily through anecdote, one thing becomes certain: Prancer's not for everyone, but there's one home out there that is perfect for this craze-fueled canine. It's the exact same thing, 3+1. So my students will either explicitly state the term or imply it. And here's the reason why. When we get into the syllogistic body paragraphs, If a student implies it in the thesis, they usually explicitly state it in the first premise and vice versa. You don't want any redundancy at word level and even at the sentence level throughout the paper. So my students do a good job of teeter-tottering that implicit-explicit balance. So I promised you 3. Yes, you can do this. It's not that hard. Here it is for a 3rd time. At our wit's end, with what is apparently a futile effort to ship off this crazy mutt, Fortuna gives it one last attempt in this humor-laden plea. Carefully delineating the pros and cons of taking Prancer into one's home, she very matter-of-factly states that such an adoption will take a ton of yeoman's work, patience, and divine intervention. Knowing that the negatives far outweigh the positives, the sentence structures are often overburdened to reflect the tall order at hand. Principally through anecdote and enumeration, the decision is perfectly laid out at a prospective parent's feet. One cute, albeit demonic dog desperately needs a good home. So the 3 terms, devices, techniques are manifestly there. I'm cooking up my sentence constructs, and just for clarity's sake, when you get into patterning, which I got a ton of videos on, you can see in the second sentence that I do something called a trio, where you go, where is it here? Yeoman's work, patience, and divine intervention. So that's called a trio when you enumerate or list in a series of 3s. So my students will duo, they'll trio, and they'll quadruple. It's just part of the patterning. So to model for my kids what we're doing in class during the Nuance Academy, I model it in the writing so that hopefully they will transfer it over into their writing and do a little bit of monkey see, monkey do. And all of it's there. I got 1 sentence of ethereal intent, 3 sentences, construction of meaning, total of 4. My vocab's up, and that's how you manipulate or wield the declarative thesis heuristic. If you're writing with me, good place to pause, have your kids give it a try. We still got more to do, and we got to ask ourselves the question. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And as I've alluded, we're going to proceed syllogistically. This comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle had a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And just like us composition teachers, he was principally concerned with how students lay down their arguments. And he was looking to teach something that he called cogency. We call it line of reasoning. And he gave his kids a heuristic to make sure that they had lines of reasoning that stayed perfectly intact. And he basically created like a mathematical computative formula to ensure its occurrence. And all you do is go premise, premise, conclusion in your thinking. So each body paragraph is going to be a total of 1 syllogism in which you go premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. And Aristotle would look at that example and say, Kristian, that's very cogent. But how do you morph that into a heuristic for the purposes of performing rhetorical analysis? I got you covered. The first premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. And again, if you explicitly stated it up top in the thesis, you're going to imply and vice versa. No redundancy, right? You don't want to reiterate yourself. That takes 3 sentences. And the reason being is I want my students to keep the centrality of their argument. If they get quoting too early in the body paragraph or paraphrasing, they break the demand of the assignment. And they write plot analysis, not rhetorical analysis. So it's kind of a bulletproof method to ensure that they are sticking to the demand of the assignment and they're rhetorically assessing and appraising the text. 4th sentence begins the second premise, and this is where we're going to teeter-totter our quoting and our paraphrasing. You don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. And then body paragraphs need conclusions. You got to come full circle. You go all the way back to the prompt, all the way back to the thesis. Keep the promise of the first premise. So let's start with that first premise and ask ourselves, what's a first premise look like? And I always got you covered. So check this out. Students ask me often, where do I begin? And I always say, start where the author starts. So I give my students a stem. It's just a clause and it's very short, right from the onset, comma. It cues the reader into knowing that you have a chronology, that you have a sequence, that you're going to stay very organized and lay down a perfectly cogent line of reasoning. So I just cherry pick the terms of the devices techniques that Fortuna uses up top in the upper third of the piece. So look what I got going on here. Right from the onset, Fortuna does not tiptoe around her overwhelming sense of fatigue and dejectedness she feels at the seemingly impossible prospect of pawning off Prancer. Not only is she at her wit's end, but the truncated sentences also carry a certain heavy weight. Beginning with a long litany of the dog's apparent flaws and liabilities, she readily acknowledges that this is a very difficult sale. So the first premise is a promise. And what my students do next is they go textual support hunting. Well, let's break down that first premise into a promise. So the first thing you got to do is get quotes and paraphrases about the ethos, like that fatigue state, that overwhelm, that futile effort that she is embarking upon. The second thing that you got to take a look at is the syntax, because you promised it. You also got to take a look at the litany. And then overall, you're getting at the exigence of it as well. So you need quotes and or paraphrases for that in order to keep the promise of the first premise. So let's transition to the fourth sentence, right? You got to go get quotes and or paraphrases for everything you promised in that first premise. So look how I do this. Immediately, Fortuna commences with an exhausted interjection that admits, okay, she's tried, right? That's the perfect quote for the first promise I made in the first premise. Everything needs to be germane. Everything needs to be relevant in order for there to be a line of reasoning intact. But when you quote, you got to analyze it. Not for nothing, but perhaps futile as it may be, she has tried for the last several months to post this dog for adoption and make him sound palatable. Within the statement of her exigence, the ellipses state her conundrum. Prancer is definitely an acquired taste. So check syntax, right? So I talked about syntax in the promise of my first premise. Like a pill that is tough to swallow, there's no way to soften the fact that he is a demonic chihuahua hellscape, right? So I also talked about the exigence and the fact that there's more bad qualities to this dog than good, and she has that juxtaposition between the two. Knowing that offloading such a dog is seemingly an impossible task, Fortuna goes the route of humor in terms of making her sales pitch somewhat attractive. So check off the pathos, right? Got that. Beginning with the bad news first, she provides a grocery list of all of Prancer's flaws, setbacks that culminate in equating him to a vessel for a traumatized Victorian child that now haunts her home. All right, so I said litany earlier, so this time I just said grocery list. That's what I mean. Don't reiterate. You can use synonyms. Like a ghoul or vindictive specter, he terrorizes everything in sight. But there's a caveat, even an upside. Prancer only likes women, nothing else. As Fortuna transitions to enumerate the very few positive traits of this dog, her abrupt sentence flow continues to belie her fatigue and a hard sell. Each plus is counterbalanced by a negating plus that renders him to little more than a 13-pound rage machine. Right. So I got enough support and analysis in there for everything that I promised in the first premise. And all the quotes and paraphrases are totally linked up to the promise of that first premise. But we got to cross the finish line. We got to bring this all the way back to the prompt and all the way back to the thesis. And the conclusion usually takes like 2 or 3 sentences. So look how I wrap this up. Even though Prancer's inherent disposition is deeply flawed and apparently possessed, Fortuna pleads her case. Dog lovers are abundantly available, so she reasons that there must be at least one perfect fit for this Chucky doll in a dog's body. And that takes like 10 to 12 sentences, as all syllogistic body paragraphs must. So those 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids write, they typically don't have enough support and analysis in there to fully flesh out an argument. So again, if you're writing with me, pause, give it a whirl, give it a try. But that's only 2 paragraphs, intro, 1 body. What do you do next? The answer is easy. You bust out another syllogism. This is going to be a 4-paragraph essay. So on Langen Lit for the college board exams, my students do 4-paragraph essays, intro, 2 body, conclusion. And basically, you got to ask yourself the question, what's left? Well, we still got like half of the piece left to analyze. So we're at about the middle. Again, you go chronologically. So you're just going to reload the first premise, 3 sentences, get your terms, devices, techniques, change up the quotes, shoot for 10 to 12 sentences, make sure you wrap it all up, and again, keep the promise of the first premise. So I'm not going to do the whole syllogism for you, but let me show you a first premise that I would use for a second body paragraph. And if students are writing along with me, just steal my first premise and write the rest. You can practice, go quote hunting, and make sure that you're sustaining your line of reasoning. So here it is. In her continuation to seal this hard deal, Fortuna makes a few humor-laden pop cultural allusions to plead Prancer's case, right? So if I recall, you got the reference to The Office, Gremlins, and the Chucky movie, right? So those allusions are really important. But in anecdotally enumerating the small balance of endearing traits, so we haven't gotten to the fact that it's anecdotally told, her conjunctions add an honest reality check. So I'm going to do more syntax here and just look at the conjunction. So I need quotes and paraphrases for all of this. Maintaining hope in this last-ditch effort, she yet again relies on the appeal to humor to pawn off her fostered terror. So I got to take a look at the pathos as well. What's cool about taking 3 sentences is that it precludes students from doing the 1-paragraph diction, 1-paragraph syntax, 1-paragraph ethos. That's too dutiful, too plodding, and it definitely is going to preclude kids from earning the sophistication point. So I like it when they multitask. So from there, go fetch some support, right? You made a promise in that first premise. Go align all the quotes and paraphrases and finish up that body paragraph. But we also need to wrap up the essay. We got to tag a conclusion paragraph on it. And I use some stems early in the year that look like this, right? Just kind of culminating stems, like a fireworks display in the grand finale. I always tell my students the conclusion paragraph is the grand finale of your fireworks display. So big encapsulating statements like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day. So anything like that, and it usually takes 3 or 4 sentences. Here's my conclusion. I used at the end of the day, comma. At the end of the day, comma, Prancer only needs to win the heart of one pet parent. While his baggage would overburden an airport carousel, he nonetheless has a few traits that are endlessly endearing and worthy of big love. Prancer's not everyone's perfect pet companion, but he is certain to complete someone's picture-perfect family. And that's kind of the whole exigence of the piece, right? And the whole kit and caboodle, you want to stay at the end. All right, I'm going to sign off here. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me with any questions or suggestions, drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I also have a website, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. Throughout the academic year, the calendar year, I do a ton in the ELA community. So free webinars with perfection learning, applied practice, NCTE, the College Board, you name it. I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. And as far as professional development offerings that I have in the imminent future here, one of the things I'm doing is my Teach It Right 5-week one-to-one mentorship. So a lot of you are familiar with the fact that I used to run masterminds with National Writing Project, and so many teachers in their feedback said, I loved it, but I wish I could have taken it one-on-one with you because I really have specific needs. I have a specific demographic, and it would have been nice to tailor make or custom make the course specific to my needs. So, hey, I listened. I'm going to do that. So if you want to work one-on-one and learn everything about my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, my heuristics, and basically build a new paradigm around who you got in your classroom, in your district, in your course offerings, let's work together. We take 5 weeks to do it. We build around your schedule and my schedule, and it's 90 minutes a class times 5, and there's 2 follow-up consultations at 90 minutes apiece. And I have a Google Classroom that you have access to with all of my content and material. So you have lesson plans for years and years and years and years, and I add to that Google Classroom on a weekly basis. I also have a self-paced course because I know some people are busy and they don't have time for courses. So it's a 10 video course, and you can basically pick and choose whatever it is you want to focus on. So if you're teaching AP Lang and you're like, I really need some help with rhetorical analysis, you got videos on that, synthesis, argument, lit analysis, doing short stories, the Nuance Academy, the Word Study Academy, alternative grading methods. So there's 10 of them there, and you also have access to the Google Classroom with the purchase of that. And then the last thing is I'm really well known for my alternative grading methods, and I'm offering a 2-hour one-to-one intensive. So I can get a sense of your grading needs, your demographics, your students, your grading load, and custom tailor make a alternative grading methods course so that you are less burdened and taxed by your grading load. And we can go over some of my really good alternative grading methods so that you can reclaim your evenings and weekends. So that's it from here. In the days, weeks, months, years to come, I will keep the videos coming. Reach out if you got any questions.